welcome to the Iowa Grazing Academy. These are the recordings from the 5 online sessions that were held in July of 2026. If you have any questions, please contact Shelby Gruss at the email address listed on the slide. Thank you and enjoy these sessions. Hello, and welcome.
Yes, so I'm going to be talking about a little bit about starting rotational stocking and paddocks and estimating that forage. Some of this is going to kind of overlap a little bit of what Margaret just talked about, and then we're going to dive a little bit deeper into some of the concepts she was talking about as well. This is something I think that you kind of build on as you go, and hearing it twice is not a bad thing sometimes. And so really, we're just going to start off with that like rotational stocking like doesn't have to be this crazy intricate thing, and you don't have to do what your neighbor does. I love the point that Margaret was making is like it needs to fit in your schedule. You don't want to hate your life doing it every single time, and it needs to fit your system as well. And what are your goals? That's always what I like to start with. What's your goals for this? I really appreciated Margaret's photos as she was trying to get pollinators back. And so maybe that grazing strategy is going to be just a little bit different than somebody that's like, I want to maximize forage production this year, and what that kind of looks like and how we do that. And so I started off with a couple terminologies as well. We're not going to really dive into stacking density and stacking rate because Margaret covered that perfectly. And so, but two of the things that I like to think about is your grazing period versus your rest period and what that looks like. And so your grazing period is how long your animals are actually staying on that one paddock before moving. A lot of times we think of shorter grazing periods, really thinking about that regrowth of the plant, trying to avoid animals going back to that plant and grazing it before it's ready again. And then that rest period, and that rest period is what really gives our plants an ability to recover and help with the persistence of those plants in those paddocks for longer. And so this is how long a paddock recovers before it's grazed again. And this is a lot of times where that yield comes from, and trying to balance how long that rest period needs to be for recovery, and then potentially the quality of those plants as well. And so really looking at that balancing factor there. And then a couple other things that I want to talk about is harvest efficiency versus grazing efficiency. And a lot of times I hear this used interchangeably. And the reason that I'm just bringing it up is because depending on how we estimate our forage biomass, we'll be talking about harvest efficiency or grazing efficiency. And so harvest efficiency is the amount of grazed material out of the whole plant. And so we're considering basically from ground up on, we're considering the whole plant and how much is actually getting ingested by the animal. And so a lot of times we typically see harvest efficiency only sitting at about 15 to 35%. Now, that may seem low when I hear a lot of people actually talking about grazing efficiency. And grazing efficiency is out of the allocated material. So we're already taking out the fact we're leaving behind that 4 inches of residual so that that plant can regrow. We don't consider that. It's the amount we give the animal and how much it actually gets into the animal's mouth. And so typically that's a little bit higher. That's at that 50, 70, 80%. And so this is how much is getting ingested versus how much is being trampled out of the amount we're giving the animals. And the reason that I just wanted to kind of talk about that is when we start estimating how many animals we can have out there or how long we can have the animals out there, we need to know what amount of forage we should be using for that estimation. So if we're giving total biomass of the whole pasture from ground up, a lot of times we're looking at the harvest efficiency. Now, if we're only looking at the amount allocated to the animals, then we should be using grazing efficiency to estimate that value. And we'll dive into those numbers in just a little bit later in this presentation. And so what better management buys you? And Margaret covered these very well, and even had more on there. And I just kind of wanted to do some highlights. Is typically we can increase the utilization of that pasture or that grazing utilization. We're controlling the grazing and the rest period. We're making animals move around. We're making them eat more of it and not just select what they like. Typically, we can start to see longer grazing days. We can extend how long we can be out there because we're getting better utilization and we're getting better forage mass throughout the season. And so more of that forage is getting in the animals' mouths, and we're not losing more of it just by trampling or leaving it behind. or just animals not utilizing it. We get more even manure distribution and nutrients spread across the field. There's some really interesting studies out there. One particularly that always comes to mind is in this study, I believe it was in New Zealand that it was done, is when they continuously stocked the pasture versus when they rotationally grazed it. But when they stocked the pasture, continuously stocked it for one animal unit per hectare, they saw that in the first year of grazing, over like 80% of that pasture had never saw any manure or urine. And so forcing the animals to move around the pasture, we're going to start to see that manure being forced around as well. And then typically I like to think of it as a more resilient system. We start to, that rest builds a buffer, as Margaret was talking about with um, the I'm blanking right now. The management intensive grazing systems, we can have these rest periods. We can start setting aside stockpiling. We could potentially be haying that instead, especially in the springtime, or we could maybe add stockers, so we can kind of be a little bit more flexible in what we're doing. But also, we can be adjusting our stocking densities and our rest periods for drought, trying to make that forage more available later instead of hurting it now, where we're going to start to see deficits later on because we overdid it early. And so what are the factors that we can do to be adjusted? And there's one that shouldn't be, but factors that can be adjusted, and thinking about that. And it's really our rest period, our grazing periods, and those stocking densities. And how we can adjust those can be playing a factor in what our goals are and how we're managing those. Rest period, that can be set by the recovery. It should be set by the recovery of the plants, but not the calendar date. If we always just say we're going to rest it for 30 days, they always come back on this month on a Monday, we may be seeing differences throughout the season, because as we talked about on Monday, our growth changes for most of our plants throughout the season. So if we set it by the calendar date, typically we need to set it by the worst time frames in our calendar date. So when our growth is the slowest, so we don't hurt our plants during that time. But kind of adjusting those rest periods, grazing periods. Ideally, we could keep these as short as possible, keeping it under like 4 days. Typically, just to avoid that regrazing growing plants, stocking density higher. Typically, we get more even use. We're starting to see that we see more evenly grazed, and they can be less selective. Residual height is one that I don't think we should be really too flexible on unless we're going to go higher. We want to leave enough leaf material behind to help fuel that fast regrowth. And we're also starting to protect the roots as well. One thing to mention is that other forages can be higher. So if we're thinking of that, 4 inches is typically what I think of for our cool season pastures, where if we start to get into warm seasons, we're thinking even greater than 8 inches leaving behind to ensure that we have that regrowth and protecting those plants. And so as we're thinking about implementing this system, and I just wanted to bring back why we talked about growth and regrowth on Monday, is we want to try to graze the plants so they stay in a fast gear and being able to regrow and recharge. And so as we think about how plants grow, is typically they grow in this S curve where they start off a little slower, and then as they start to pick up, they can start to get into this exponential growth. And then as we start to enter reproductive stages, it typically slows off a little bit. And so as we're thinking about rotational stocking, it can be really ideal to stay within that exponential growth phase so that we have plenty of leaf area to regrow. We're not inhibiting those roots, but we're keeping in a quicker recovery period. Because if we always graze too low, we're going to start to inhibit that regrowth. But if we also wait too long, we're starting to push further out where the growth is starting to slow down. And this is just trying to think about optimizing the plant growth for grazing. And we're also starting to get into more mature material, which typically more mature material, we start to see declining in quality as well. And so as we're thinking about all of this, it's a lot of things that are going on all at once. And so rest period is really what I like to think about on the plant side. It's how we can give those plants an opportunity to regrow, to recover, and so they can persist for longer. And so a lot of times, this is where I start to think about, we don't want to just get set and, okay, it's always going to be resting for 30 days. Now, that can be the first step into implementing a rotational grazing system, but thinking about how our seasonalities change. And so as we think about the spring, we always think about the spring flush. This is like where growth is very explosive. And we start to see that we typically can't keep up with how fast these plants are growing. And so spring flush, we're thinking about only grazing. We could be resting for a shorter period, 14 to 20 some days, depending on how much rain we're getting. And so it could be really quickly, whereas we start getting into the summer, where our cool season grasses slow down a lot because of the heat, they start to slow, their regrowth slows. And so we may need to give them a greater rest period at that time so that they have time to recover. And then as we get back into the fall, cooler temperatures start to come back in. We typically have a little bit of water stress at this time. We have pretty dry falls right now. And so we kind of are in that in-between zone where, depending on the conditions, we should be changing how long we're able to rest those plants. And so this kind of can just start to think about how these plants need that rest period and how it adapts throughout the season. And so it's just something to be thinking about. And that's why sometimes just having it on the calendar can lead us into issues. And if we do base it on the calendar, then we really should be basing it on the slowest time period. Because if we base it on what our spring flush is doing, then when we start getting into our summer and our fall, we will not have enough forage for those animals because those plants will not be able to recover as quickly. And so keep the grazing period short, typically. Short grazing periods with a large number of paddocks, we can get those number of rest days. But kind of going back to how Margaret was talking about regrowth, if we keep it short, typically the animals are going to graze it once. They're not going to be able to get to any of that regrowth. 5 to 7 days, it's starting to get into that period where we may start to see animals starting to graze that regrowth. But as we push that out to 8+ days, on the number of days that we're actually grazing that paddock, we can start to see those animals going back and selecting for basically that recovering plant. And that goes back to a little bit about what we talked about on Monday again, is we should be moving those animals off its regrowth before it's tall enough to graze again, because animals have a preference. They typically like that green tissue. They like that young tissue. And so we could see them going back to that young tissue regrowing. Again, also they like legumes typically over grasses. So we're allowing them to be a little bit more selective. And so we may start to see some detriment by allowing them to start to regraze that regrowth. And so now we're going to switch a little bit, kind of talked about how all of those things can impact our grazing, but really how we can start implementing that and what the number of paddocks do and how those all can play a role in our grazing systems. And so typically the more paddocks we have, typically we start to see utilization increase. We start to see our grazing efficiency increase because we're not allowing those animals to be selective. They can't just kind of wander around trampling things until they decide this is the bite of food I want to take. I always think about, I love the photo where all the animals were packed in together. I think about like family table on Thanksgiving with all my brothers back. You grab what you can, or else you're probably not going to be able to eat very much. And so it's taking that next bite of food. And so we see that grazing efficiency go up as we increase those number of paddocks, because typically we're starting to increase that stacking density. And so animals have to kind of take that bite of food and not be as selective. And so what can we do? And so typically when we think about what makes this work, is we have to be thinking about our water, our fencing, and our design and lanes and access. And so water is generally the number one constraint with implementing a rotational stacking system. movable waters is a great way with portable tanks. You can think about quick couple hydrants, let the water follow the herd. This is because as we think about water, water is necessary for animals, and animals typically like to stay close to water. And so as we think about as animals get further away from 800 to 1,000 feet, they start to camp closer to the water tank, and we're going to start to see utilization go down within that paddock the further away we get from the water. Fencing, we don't want to start off with just, if we're going to implement a rotational stocking system, we don't want to start off with putting permanent fence everywhere. We want to be flexible. And so having our permanent fence outside, very important. That is a law in Iowa. We need a permanent perimeter fence, but our interior fencing, let's have that be flexible, being able to move that around. A single strand of polywire, typically as animals adapt to rotational stocking, will respect it. There are portable sheep and goat fencing that polynet, and those are different options, but this can help us kind of make our system adaptable throughout the season. But also, typically the first time we implement something, we learn from it and we want to do something different next time. So having something that's able to be flexible and adapt for later can be really helpful in those cases. And thinking about design for lanes and access, simple lane or gate plans can help move the animals to next paddock. If you are on a dairy, thinking about making sure the animals have easy access to the barn each day. Just kind of thinking about the whole plan. I like to kind of look at the aerial view of the field, and then being able to lay it out to ensure that that your system and your rotation is going to be able to work well. But like to think about starting with the water, and then fencing, we can move around, keeping that infrastructure as flexible as possible so that we can kind of adapt from year to year or even season to season on that. And so how many paddocks do we need as we're starting to put this out? There's a simple equation you can kind of use is how long do you want to rest your plants versus how long do you want to graze your plants? And then you add one. The adding one is because basically that's the paddock that the animals are on right now. And so then the rest of them are resting. And so, for example, and the example we have here is if you have a 30-day rest period, you want to graze for 3 days. So 30 divided by 3 is 10 plus 1. You need 11 paddocks to do that. And so it's just a simple way to start thinking about how often can I move it? Maybe my animals are an hour away, and so I only want to move them once a week, but I want to make sure I give them 35-day rest period. Then you can start to figure out how many paddocks you're going to be potentially needing for your system. This is just an example. Fewer paddocks, they're okay too, and they work too. It's just something to be thinking about as you are adapting your system. And then sizing your paddock. And so this is a way to kind of estimate how many animals you can have out there or how big of a paddock you need. And so typically I like to think about how much an animal needs, how much forage we have, and then that can get us into how big of a paddock we need for those animals. And so first one is that daily demand for the animals. And this is how we can think about how much dry matter per day they need. And so we have the number of cows that are out there, the animal weights, and their intake. And their intake is going to vary depending on the class of animal you have. There are lots of charts out there that you can take a look at. That pasture management guide that Margaret showed earlier has great resources on this and some tables to help with this as well. But for this work through, we have 50 cows that are 1,300 pounds with a 2.5% daily intake. And so we multiply all those together to get that they're going to need about 1,600 pounds of dry matter per day. And so then we get into, okay, how much forage do I have then? And this one, we're going to be using grazing utilization because we're going to start grazing at 10 inches and stop grazing at 4 inches. And so that's going to be 6 inches of growth I'm giving them. And this is an estimation that I get from the grazing sticks, which we're going to talk about in just a second, but the 250 pounds of dry matter per inch per acre. And so this is an estimation of how much dry matter is per inch of that forage. And so it's at 6 times 250 pounds times our grazing utilization of 60%. And that's going to give us approximately 900 pounds of dry matter per acre are available and are actually going to be grazed by the animals and not trampled or left behind. And so finally, that can give us into our paddock sizes. And so if we're going to have a 3-day stay, bringing it over from the previous slide, we have 3 times that 1,600 pounds that the animals are going to need per day. And so we're going to need about 4,800 pounds of dry matter that are needed. And so to get the number of acres now, it's 4,800 pounds divided by the 900 pounds per dry matter per acre to get 5.4 acres per paddock for those animals, for those 50 animals to be able to stay on that one paddock for 3 days. And so this is some math that can be done. If as you're starting to implement it, I think putting some of these equations into a Google file that you can type into your phone helps a lot. But it's just something to be thinking about. And so that can help you start your grazing period. Now, these systems aren't static like we've talked about. And so estimating that forage mass can be really important to really understand how long you really can be out there. And as we get into this, Margaret made a great point, and a lot of people that I know that have been grazing for a long time, they can just look at it and they can be like, look at the height, kind of look at the density, and they have a really good idea of how much forage and how much area they can give those animals. And so we always want to think about what is our residual that we want to stop at, that 4 inches, that 3 to 4 inches, then move them off before it gets lower. And is the next paddock ready to graze, and how much forage they have out there? And so going out there, especially as we're starting, measuring that can be really important. And there's a couple ways that we can do that. There's grazing sticks. Grazing sticks are, we have the Iowa Grazing Stick that's available. It's a way to take a look at density. So typically you lay it down on the ground in the forage, and you look at, there's some density dots, and we want to count how many dots you can see, because the less dots you can see, the thicker that forage is, and most likely the more of it there is. And then that gets into consideration for the height of that forage, that canopy height of the forage as well. And both of those take into consideration to give you a forage estimate. And typically that forage estimate is on the stick as well. Sorry, I don't have a zoom in of this, but we will go more into this in the in-person sessions. The next is a plate meter, a raising plate meter. This is really quick reading. So you typically just walk it around, and what it does is it takes the compressed sward height. And so it pushes down on the sward. So it gets an idea of the density of that canopy and then that height, and that'll give you an estimation of how much forage mass is out there. And then the last one, as simple as number, is start and end heights. And then basically training yourself over time, you're going to be able to build you're going to build the skills to being able to look out there using just your eyeball, using a grazing stick or a yardstick. But really knowing what's out there is going to be very important to ensure that we're keeping the health of that stand long term. And so this is just an estimation of a seasonal game plan in Iowa. We have that spring flush. You're basically racing against something that's growing very, very quickly typically. And so we want to start grazing at that like 8 to 10 inches. We don't want to graze too early, because remember, this is regrowing from root reserves from over winter. But as it starts to pick up, it's going to speed up, and we should be making quick rotations at this time. And we want to try to not let those plants head out. And that goes back to that growth and regrowth we were talking about on Monday, again, grazing those plants and trying to remove that growing point as it moves up the plant, and it'll force it back into vegetative state the rest of the summer on those cool season grasses. Then we hop into that summer slump. Let's protect that stand, slower rotations, giving them a longer rest period to be able to recover. It's typically better to bridge gaps with something else like a summer annual, which we'll talk about on Monday, or stored feed or destocking. If we hurt our plants now, we're going to hurt the roots. We're going to hurt that recovery, which we're going to see that more long-term affecting us. And then in the fall, those pastures are starting to recover. They're going to be able to regrow a little bit more quickly in those cooler temperatures. And it's a great time to be thinking about potentially stockpiling and setting up for winter grazing. And then winter grazing, going into that stockpiled forage, best use a great stockpiler, and thinking about that strip stocking that Margaret was talking about, really being able to utilize something that's not going to regrow, but just being adaptive throughout the season to be able to implement these systems. Again, not one system fits all. And so some things that can go wrong and what we're thinking about with rotational stacking is just rotating on autopilot, just that fixed calendar date, not adapting to the seasons can kind of put us in a hole later on. And so I just kind of merged these first two because they're very similar, because if we focus on a spring pace in July, we're going to dig ourselves in a hole very fast. But so if we do want to do it on a calendar date, let's focus on what we're going to see in July and implement that across the season. Too few paddocks and long stays. If we have a long stays, we're going to start to see those animals regraze basically those recovering plants. So they're going to hit them again. And add paddocks, shorten those grazing periods can be really beneficial. No water plan. If we need to focus on where the water is, trying to make those waters portable if possible. Water typically is one of our biggest holdups in implementing a lot of these systems. And then grazing too short. And when I say too short, I mean too low of a residue. So overgraze, we're going to start to see those plants becoming more shallow rooted. They're not going to be able to recover as quickly. So make sure we hold that residual height. And again, we can feed hay or destock before we graze to the dirt, because grazing to the dirt, typically, if we don't have a goal for that, and we're trying to keep those plants persistent to the plants we have in there, we're going to see really short, hard recoveries and see that impacting us later on. And so lastly, this is the last thing I just kind of want to leave you with. You don't need a perfect system to begin with. Just starting off with the simple splits can really just start to help understand where those rotations are going to be beneficial and where that's going to be. Adding a potential movable water can be really helpful to keep animals from camping out in a single area. Move on a simple trigger, graze to approximate heights of 4 inches, move to the next paddock when it starts to hit 8 to 10 inches, but walk your pastures regularly, make those moves based on when the forage is ready. Watch and subdivide, kind of see what you're doing, see how it pays off. Take notes. I think always learning from what we did previously is super helpful. And this is not a one size fits all. Start small, work your way up, see what fits for you, and be flexible. Just because it works for your neighbor, that does not mean this is what needs to happen on your operation, and make it for your goals. And so just some last 5 key takeaways from this whole thing. Rotational stocking, it controls when and where you're grazing. Rest is invaluable. And typically we have this rule of thumb: take half, leave half, protect that lower 4 inches of residual to fuel that fast regrowth. Think about how many paddocks you have, and just a simple rotation can really help improve from a continuous stocking. And then look at your pasture and not the calendar. Actually getting out there and seeing that is going to be really important.